50 master mechanics, 50 failures. When a notorious Hells Angels president rolled his cursed $1.5 million custom Harley into the shop, it came with a violent ultimatum. Nobody could find the phantom glitch until a 22-year-old rookie cracked the engine block and uncovered a chilling, impossible secret. The rain was coming down in sheets over Oakland, California, hammering against the corrugated steel roof of Dawson's Custom Works. Inside, the air smelled heavily of degreasers, stale coffee, and raw fear. Rick Dawson, a grizzly veteran mechanic with 30 years of grease permanently tattooed into his knuckles, stood paralyzed by the rolling bay doors. A flatbed tow truck had just backed into the lot, its diesel engine grumbling like a chained beast. But it wasn't the truck that had Rick's stomach tied in knots. It was the cargo and the men escorting it. 3 men dismounted from their own perfectly tuned backers. They wore heavy leather cuts, the rain slicking off the iconic winged death's head patches on their backs. They were Hells Angels, Oakland charter, and leading them was a man known throughout the West Coast underground as Iron Jack Taggart. Taggart was a mountain of a man, his face scarred by decades of asphalt and bar fights, his eyes colder than the Pacific in December. On the back of the flatbed sat a motorcycle that looked less like a machine and more like a rolling piece of dark mythology. It was known in the underworld as the Crimson Wraith. To the untrained eye, it was just a heavily modified, elongated Harley-Davidson. But to men like Rick Dawson, it was royalty. The Wraith was valued by insurance adjusters and private collectors at a staggering $1.5 million. It wasn't just the sheer volume of 24-karat gold leaf detailing or the custom-milled aerospace-grade aluminum chassis. It was the provenance. The bike contained the melted-down silver rings of 6 fallen chapter presidents in its gas tank cap. The engine casing was a one-of-a-kind prototype milled in the late 1970s, passed down through the club's hierarchy like a crown jewel. Taggart walked past Rick without a word, stepping into the dry warmth of the shop. He pointed a massive, leather-gloved finger at the Wraith as it was lowered from the flatbed. 50, Taggart growled, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that vibrated in the chests of everyone in the room. 50 of the supposed best mechanics from Los Angeles to Seattle. Boys who build bikes for Hollywood actors and billionaire tech kids. Every one of them charged me a premium. Every fobber, for a single one of them promised me it was fixed. Rick swallowed hard, stepping forward. What's the issue, mister? Taggart? It's a ghost, Taggart said, stripping off his wet gloves. The bike runs like a dream around town. Sounds like thunder. But you get her out on the highway, open her up, and the second the needle hits exactly 74 miles an hour, she dies. She doesn't just stall out. The engine screams like a dying dog, the electrical shorts out, and the rear wheel locks up. Nearly threw me into a semi-truck outside Bakersfield last week. Rick wiped his hands on a rag, trying to keep them from shaking. Could be a fuel starvation issue at high RPMs, or a bad ground in the custom wiring harness, vibrating loose at that specific frequency. Taggart laughed, a harsh, humorless sound. Yeah, that's what Big Tony down in Long Beach said. Charged me $4,000 to rewire the whole bike. Didn't work. Ciati Steve swore it was the S&S carburetor. Rebuilt the whole intake. Didn't work. Another guy in Portland thought the transmission gears were expanding under heat. Rebuilt the tranny. Didn't work. Taggart stepped uncomfortably close to Rick, towering over the older mechanic. I'm tired of excuses, Rick. I'm tired of guys in fancy shops telling me they can fix my bike and then handing me a piece of garbage that tries to kill me at highway speeds. This bike represents the blood of my club. You have 1 week. You fix the Wraith, and I'll pay you double whatever your highest quote is. But if you call me and tell me it's done, and I take it out on the I-8 or 80, and it dies at 74 miles an hour again. Taggart didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. He looked slowly around the shop, taking in the expensive tools, the vintage motorcycles, and finally, Rick's pale face. 1 week, Dawson. With that, Taggart and his men walked out into the rain, leaving the Crimson Wraith dripping water onto the pristine concrete floor of the shop. In the far corner of the garage, sweeping up metal shavings, stood Leo Stanton. Leo was 22, scrawny and painfully quiet. He had grown up on a failing farm in Nebraska, spending his childhood keeping ancient, rusted John Deere tractors running with nothing but scavenged parts, and a freakish, almost savant-like intuition for mechanics. He didn't have formal certifications. He didn't have tattoos. He was a rookie who made minimum wage, sweeping floors and doing oil changes, mostly because he lacked the social skills to deal with customers. But as Rick and the senior mechanics gathered around the $1.5 million bike with looks of utter despair, Leo leaned on his broom and stared at the engine block. While the other men saw a cursed machine that could cost them their lives, Leo saw a puzzle. And Leo never left a puzzle unsolved. For the first 4 days, the atmosphere inside Dawson's Custom Works was suffocating. Rick had pulled his top 3 mechanics off every other project. There was Gregory, the electrical wizard, Dutch, the engine specialist who used to build drag racing motors, and Bill, a master fabricator. They treated the Crimson Wraith like an unexploded bomb. They put down thick rubber mats before placing their wrenches. They wrapped the gold leaf fenders in soft microfiber blankets. And then they began to tear it apart. Let's start with the obvious, Dutch had said on Tuesday morning, hooking up a massive diagnostic machine to the custom ignition module. If 50 guys missed it, it's not going to be a simple loose wire. It has to be a catastrophic failure in the harmonic balancers. At exactly 74 miles an hour, the vibration of the road and the RPMs of the engine are matching, creating a resonant frequency that's physically violently shaking the internal components until the sensors panic and kill the spark. It sounded incredibly smart. Rick bought it. For 2 days, Dutch and Gregory meticulously tore down the primary drive. They replaced the stator, the rotor, and completely isolated the ignition coil with custom molded silicone dampeners to absorb the vibrations. They flushed the fuel lines, recalibrated the jets on the massive dual carburetors, and triple-checked every millimeter of the wiring harness. By Thursday night, the shop was a mess of empty Red Bull cans and discarded parts. The men were exhausted, their eyes bloodshot, snapping at each other over dropped wrenches. "All right," Rick said, rubbing his temples. "Strap her to the dyno. Let's see what happens." They carefully rolled the heavy, gleaming motorcycle onto the dynamometer machine that allows a motorcycle to be ridden at high speeds while remaining stationary in the shop, measuring its horsepower and performance. Dutch threw his leg over the saddle. He fired it up. The Wraith roared to life with a sound that shook dust from the rafters. It sounded perfect, guttural, powerful, flawless. Dutch clicked it into gear and started rolling on the throttle. The massive rear wheel spun on the dyno drum, 40 miles an hour, smooth as glass. 50 miles an hour. The exhaust note was a beautiful, deafening symphony. 65 miles an hour. Red crossed his fingers, holding his breath. "Taking her to 70, Dutch yelled over the roar, twisting the grip. The digital speedometer on the wall climbed. 71, 72, 73.4, 74. The moment the digital readout flashed 74, a horrific screech erupted from the engine block. It sounded like metal tearing through metal. A thick plume of black smoke violently shot out of the exhaust, and the engine completely seized. The rear tire locked up instantly, skidding violently against the dyno drum with a shriek of burning rubber. The entire bike bucked so hard, it nearly threw Dutch over the handlebars, despite the heavy restraining straps. Silence rushed back into the shop, broken only by the ticking of the cooling metal and the heavy, panicked breathing of the mechanics. "No," Rick whispered, his face draining of color. "No, no, no." Dutch slowly stepped off the bike, throwing his gloves onto the floor in disgust. "I'm out, Rick. I'm sorry. I don't know what the hell is inside that motor, but it defies physics. It's a mechanical impossibility. The stator is fine. The spark is fine. Something inside the actual sealed engine case is shifting at that exact speed. If I have to open a custom-milled case to find it, I risk destroying a priceless piece of history. I'm not taking that liability, and I'm not dealing with Taggart." Gregory and Bill silently nodded in agreement. The veterans were broken. They had hit the exact same wall the other 50 mechanics had hit. Rick slumped against a workbench, putting his head in his hands. It was Thursday night. Taggart was coming on Monday. He briefly considered calling his brother in Florida to see if he could sleep on his couch for a few years. Meanwhile, standing in the shadows by the tool crib, Leo Stanton watched. He hadn't spoken a word all week. But while Dutch and Gregory had been looking at computer readouts and wiring diagrams, Leo had been listening. Leo's brain worked differently. Where others heard a loud roar, Leo heard individual layers of sound: the clatter of the push rods, the intake of the valves, the microscopic whining of the bearings. And when the bike had seized at 74 miles per hour, Leo hadn't been looking at the exhaust smoke. He'd been looking at the heavy, customized oil pressure gauge mounted on the side of the tank. For a fraction of a millisecond before the engine screamed, the oil pressure hadn't dropped, it had spiked. Unnaturally high. Friday night came. Rick sent everyone home early, telling them he needed to make some calls. The shop was locked up, dark and silent, save for the rain that had returned to batter the Oakland streets. At 11 p.m., the side door of the shop clicked open. Leo slipped inside, turning on a single overhead bulb. He walked over to the Crimson Wraith, pulling his personal battered toolbox behind him. He didn't bring a diagnostic computer. He didn't bring electrical tape. He brought a mechanic's stethoscope, a torque wrench, and a specialized set of Allen keys. Leo knew what the veterans didn't. They were treating the bike like a modern machine with a computer glitch. But beneath the $1.5 million exterior, beneath the gold and the legend, this was an old mechanical soul. And old souls didn't lie. Leo knelt beside the massive engine block. He placed the stethoscope against the cold metal of the oil pump housing. He began manually turning the rear wheel by hand, millimeter by millimeter, listening to the agonizingly slow movement of the internal gears. Click. Whir. Scrap. There. A sound so faint a dog wouldn't have heard it. A microscopic scraping deep inside the lower engine case. Leo knew what he had to do. It was the absolute cardinal sin of Dawson's Custom Works. Rick had expressly forbidden anyone from breaking the seal on the historic custom-milled engine case. If you scratched the billet aluminum, the bike lost hundreds of thousands of dollars in value. If you broke a bolt, it could never be replaced. Leo didn't care. He was a farm kid looking at a broken tractor. The price tag meant nothing to him. The logic of the machine was everything. He took a deep breath, selected his wrench, and broke the factory seal on the lower case. For 3 hours, Leo worked in total silence, carefully pulling apart the intricate, heavily modified guts of the engine. His hands were slick with high-performance synthetic oil. He removed the oil pump, the cam cover, and finally reached the heart of the lower block, the scavenge pump gears. He pulled the gear assembly out and laid it under the harsh yellow light of his work lamp. Leo leaned in, wiping the oil away with his thumb. His eyes widened. He let out a soft, incredulous breath. "You've got to be kidding me," he whispered to the empty room. There, lodged deep within the proprietary oil channeling system of place, no mechanic would ever check unless doing a complete ground-up rebuild with something that absolutely did not belong there. It wasn't a broken gear. It wasn't metal shavings. Before Leo could inspect it closer, the heavy deadbolt on the front door violently clicked. The front door swung open, accompanied by the heavy thud of steel-toed boots on concrete. "I knew Dawson would try to pull a fast one." A deep, menacing voice echoed through the dark shop. Leo froze, the oily gear assembly still in his hands. Emerging from the shadows into the dim light of Leo's work area was Iron Jack Taggart. The massive Hell's Angel wasn't wearing his cut, just a black t-shirt that showed off arms thick with prison ink. He had decided to do a surprise late-night check-in, suspecting Rick was loading the bike onto a trailer to flee town. Instead, Taggart found his $1.5 million sacred motorcycle completely torn open, its guts bleeding oil onto the floor, and a 22-year-old kid holding the heart of its engine. Taggart's eyes locked onto the broken seal of the engine case. The veins in his thick neck bulged. He reached to his waist, his hand resting on something heavy hidden under his shirt. "Boy," Taggart said. his voice dropping to a terrifying, deadly calm. What exactly do you think you are doing to my motorcycle? The silence in the garage was absolute, save for the rhythmic drumming of the rain against the steel roof. Iron Jack Taggart stepped fully into the light, his massive frame blocking the only exit. The leather of his boots creaked as he moved, his hand still resting ominously beneath his shirt. Leo Stanton, 22 years old, and soaked in synthetic motor oil, didn't scramble backward. He didn't drop the priceless engine component. He had grown up breaking untamed quarter horses and staring down aggressive farm machinery. Intimidation was just another physical force to him, like torque or gravity. "I asked you a question, boy," Taggart rumbled, his voice dropping an octave, carrying the distinct edge of a man who had survived California's most violent biker wars. "You broke the seal on the Crimson Wraith. Give me one good reason why I shouldn't make you disappear before Dawson even gets to work tomorrow." Leo blinked, his eyes shifting from Taggart's scarred face down to the oily mechanism in his hands. He wiped a smear of grease from his cheek with his forearm. "Because, Mr. Taggart," Leo said, his voice quiet but entirely steady, 50 mechanics tried to fix your motorcycle, and 50 mechanics failed. They failed because they were looking for a broken part. But this part isn't broken." Taggart stopped his advance, his heavy brow furrowing. "What the hell are you talking about?" Leo held out the heavy billet aluminum housing of the scavenge pump. He pointed a thin, grease-stained finger at a microscopic channel milled into the side of the oil gallery, a channel that absolutely should not have been there. "Somebody wanted you dead," Leo stated plainly. Taggart's posture shifted. The anger in his eyes was instantly replaced by a cold, calculating hypervigilance. He stepped closer, peering over Leo's shoulder at the greasy metal. "Show me." "It's a ghost valve," Leo explained, his awkwardness vanishing as he slipped into the language of mechanics. He pulled a tiny dental pick from his toolbox and gently pried at the dark recess of the oil channel. With a faint click, a perfectly machined, cylindrical piece of tungsten slid out, no larger than a grain of rice. Behind it was a spring so fine it looked like a strand of human hair. Taggart stared at the tiny object resting on Leo's oil-stained palm. "What is that?" "It's a masterpiece of sabotage," Leo whispered, genuine awe in his voice. "Whoever built this lower engine block, whoever milled this case, installed a dead man switch. This tungsten valve sits on a hair trigger spring inside the main oil return line. When you ride around town, the oil pressure is normal. The valve stays open." Leo grabbed a shop rag and wiped the tungsten piece clean, holding it under the harsh yellow work light. "But you're running a custom 32-tooth front sprocket," Leo continued. "To hit exactly 74 miles an hour in fifth gear, this engine has to spin at precisely 3,800 RPM. At exactly 3,800 RPM, the harmonic vibration of this specific motor, combined with the extreme oil pressure, overcomes this tiny spring. The tungsten cylinder snaps shut. It instantly blocks all oil flow to the top end of the engine. The pistons swell from the sudden catastrophic friction, and the motor seizes, locking your rear wheel." Taggart's face drained of color. He was remembering the terrifying skid on the highway outside Bakersfield, the roaring semi-truck missing him by inches. And when the bike stops, Taggart began, the realization dawning on him. "The RPMs drop to 0, Leo finished. The oil pressure vanishes. The tiny spring pushes the tungsten cylinder back into its hiding place. By the time the engine cools down and the next mechanic opens the carburetors or checks the electronics, the valve is completely hidden. The oil flows perfectly again. It's an untraceable assassination weapon. It was designed to throw you off the bike at highway speeds and make it look like a tragic mechanical failure." Taggart slowly reached out and picked up the tungsten cylinder with 2 thick fingers. He held it close to his eyes. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a heavy silver Zippo lighter, and sparked it to cast more light on the tiny metal object. "Son of a," Taggart briefed. Engraved on the flat side of the cylinder, so small it required a magnifying glass to see clearly, were 2 letters, B.H. "Bobby Hayes," Taggart whispered, his voice a lethal hiss. Leo didn't know the name, but the Oakland underworld certainly did. Bobby Blackout Hayes was a former rival president of a splinter faction, a master machinist who had supposedly made peace with Taggart's charter 5 years ago by offering to rebuild the sacred Crimson Wraith's engine case as a truce offering. The truce had been a lie. Hayes had built a time bomb, waiting for the day Taggart opened it up on the freeway. Taggart slowly closed his fist around the tungsten cylinder. He looked down at the skinny, unkempt kid, kneeling on the concrete floor. The tension in the room had completely evaporated, replaced by a profound, heavy silence. "You," Taggart said, pointing a finger at Leo. "What's your name, kid?" "Leo." "Leo Stanton." "Leo Stanton. Can you fix it? Can you put my bike back together without this curse in it?" Leo looked at the disassembled engine. He didn't see a $1.5 million piece of history. He just saw a machine that needed to breathe. "I have to bore out the road channel, sleeve it with a high-heat titanium insert to permanently block the false gallery, and completely rebuild the scavenge pump. It will take me all night. I'll need to use the lathe." "Do it," Taggart ordered. He walked over to a rolling mechanic stool, kicked it closer to Leo's workstation, and sat down. He crossed his massive arms. "I'm not leaving. I want to watch you work." For the next 7 hours, Dawson's Custom Works became a sanctuary of precision engineering. The storm raged outside, but inside, the only sounds were the high-pitched whine of the shop's metal lathe, the clinking of steel tools, and the rhythmic breathing of the Hell's Angel president watching a 22-year-old rookie perform mechanical surgery. Leo worked with a singular, beautiful focus. He didn't sweat. He didn't hesitate. He machined a microscopic titanium plug from scratch, cooling it in liquid nitrogen so it would shrink just enough to tap into the sabotaged oil gallery. As it warmed back to room temperature, the metal expanded, creating a permanent, flawless seal. He then painstakingly reassembled the scavenge pump, the camshaft, and the primary drive. By 6:30 a.m., the rain had stopped. The gray light of dawn was creeping through the frosted windows of the garage doors. Rick Dawson pulled his truck into the back lot at exactly 7 a.m. He sat in the cab for a moment, his stomach churning with dread. Today was Monday, the deadline. He had spent the entire weekend ignoring calls, contemplating liquidating his shop and fleeing to Mexico. He had nothing to show Taggart but a failed dyno run and a broken promise. Rick unlocked the side door, stepping into the dim shop. He stopped dead in his tracks. Sitting in the center of the pristine floor was the Crimson Wraith. It was fully assembled, gleaming under the fluorescent lights, completely flawless. And sitting on a leather sofa in the customer waiting area, drinking a cup of terrible break-room coffee, was Iron Jack Taggart. "Taggart," Rick stammered, his eyes darting around the shop. I can explain. Dutch and the boys, they tried." "Shut up, Rick," Taggart said, standing up. He didn't look angry. He looked entirely calm. "Where's the kid?" "Kid? You mean Leo?" Rick looked toward the wash basin. Leo was standing there, scrubbing his hands with pumice soap, looking exhausted but entirely at peace. Taggart walked over to the Wraith. He threw his leg over the saddle. He didn't bother strapping it to the dyno machine. He turned the heavy ignition switch. Click. He hit the starter. The $1.5 million engine erupted with a deafening, violent roar that shook the tools on the pegboards. Taggart revved the throttle, the massive V-twin engine responding with instantaneous, terrifying power. "Open the bay doors," Taggart roared over the engine noise. Rick, utterly confused, scrambled to hit the heavy green button on the wall. The corrugated steel doors rolled up, revealing the damp, empty streets of morning Oakland. Without putting on a helmet, Taggart dropped the bike into first gear with a heavy mechanical clunk and shot out of the garage like a rocket. Rick ran to the edge of the driveway, watching the red and gold motorcycle scream down the avenue, heading straight toward the I-80 on-ramp. "He's going to kill himself," Rick panicked, turning to Leo, who had quietly walked up beside him, drying his hands on the towel. "Leo, what did you do?" "It seizes at 74. When it locks up on the highway, his club is going to burn this building to the ground with us inside." Leo didn't answer. He just watched the empty street. 10 minutes passed. To Rick, it felt like a decade. He paced back and forth, mentally composing his last will and testament. Leo stood perfectly still, listening to the distant, echoing sounds of morning traffic. Then they heard it, a low, thunderous rumble echoing off the concrete overpasses. It grew louder, a deep, rhythmic, flawless mechanical heartbeat. The crimson wraith turned the corner and idled into the parking lot. The heat radiating off the engine block warped the cold morning air. Taggart kicked the stand down and killed the engine. The silence that followed was heavy and electric. Taggart stepped off the bike. His hair was windblown, his eyes wide and wild. He reached into his leather coat, pulled out a crushed pack of Marlboros, and lit one with shaking hands. He looked at Rick and walked straight past him, stopping directly in front of Leo Stanton. "I hit 110, Taggart breathed, a massive grin slowly spreading across his scarred face. "I pushed her to 110 miles an hour across the San Mateo Bridge. She didn't stutter. She didn't shake. She purred like a goddamn mountain lion." Rick's jaw dropped. 110? But the ghost glitch. "There was no glitch, Dawson," Taggart said, not taking his eyes off Leo. "There was a head on my life. And your four-sweeper here is the only man on the West Coast smart enough to find it." Taggart reached into his leather coat again. He pulled out a thick, heavy manila envelope and slapped it directly into Leo's chest. Leo instinctively caught it. "That's $30,000 in cash," Taggart said, his voice echoing in the quiet lot. "That's double your boss's highest quote. And it's yours, kid, not the shop's." "Yours," Taggart turned to Rick, his smile vanishing, replaced by his trademark terrifying glare. "Dawson, the kid is your new head mechanic. You pay him double what you were paying Dutch, or I'm taking him, and he's opening his own shop under my club's protection. You understand me?" "Yes, absolutely." "Yes, Mr. Taggart," Rick stammered, wiping sweat from his forehead. Taggart turned back to Leo. He extended a massive, calloused hand. Leo looked at it for a second, then reached out and shook it. Taggart's grip was like iron, but Leo's was steady. "You ever need anything in this city, kid," Taggart said quietly, "you mention my name. Nobody touches you. You're a ghost hunter now." Taggart climbed back onto the crimson wraith. He fired it up, gave Leo a final two-finger salute, and peeled out of the lot, the roar of the engine fading into the Oakland morning. Leo stood in the driveway, holding the envelope of cash. He looked down at it, then back at his boss. Rick Dawson was staring at him, utterly dumbfounded. "Leo, what the hell just happened? What did you pull out of that engine?" Leo gave a small, rare shrug, turning back toward the shop and picking up his broom. "Just a piece of bad history, Mr. Dawson. Just a piece of bad history. I need to finish sweeping the North Bay. If you love this story of gritty underdog genius and high-stakes biker drama, smash that like button right now. Have you ever solved an impossible mechanical mystery that stumped the experts? Tell us your greatest "I fixed it" moment in the comments below. Don't forget to share this video with the gearheads in your life, and subscribe for more insane, real-life mechanical legends.